Dear people watching and listening, Assalamu alaikum. Kindly like and share this video and subscribe to my YouTube channel. Please support my channel by contributing to my Patreon account so that I can continue making the audiobook series. The book continues with part 1, which tells in detail the conquest of Egypt, which happened under the Rashiduncaliphate from 639 AD to 646 AD. This conquest brought an end to the Roman Byzantine reign over Egypt, which first began in 30 BC. Egypt was also conquered and occupied by the Sassanid Empire from 618 AD to 629 AD, from the Byzantines before it was reconquered by Emperor Heraclius. Start of Chapter 10. The Caliph and the Nile. Egypt is the gift of the Nile. This is what the Greek historian Herodotus called it in the 5th century BC. It not only prospers by the Nile, it actually lives by the Nile. If there were no Nile, the country would be as barren as the deserts which flank the river. Without the Nile, there would be no Egypt. The Nile is the longest river in the world, with a length of 4,132 miles. While in Egypt it flows a distance of 750 miles as a single great river, before entering Egypt it comprises 3 rivers, the White Nile and the Blue Nile, which flow from Lake Victoria and Lake Albert, and the Atbara, which originates in the Ethiopian highlands. The White and the Blue Nile unite at Khartoum, and the Atbara joins them a little farther north, in fact at the town of Atbara. Up to Memphis, this river flows in a valley 5 to 10 miles wide, flanked by cliffs, but near Memphis it enters the delta and fans out. The delta forms a triangle with Memphis as its apex, and the Mediterranean coast as its base, roughly from Alexandria to the present Port Said. The cultivated land of the delta is actually silt deposited over countless centuries by the river, a reddish-grey silt from the Ethiopian highlands, which at places is now 50 feet deep. The floodwater, this was before the high dam at Aswan was built, was held by the farmers in basins for 6 to 8 weeks, and then drained off, leaving behind silt rich enough to grow 2 or 3 crops a year. The annual flood of the Nile was caused by heavy tropical rains in the catchment area. The timing of the flood was usually so exact that in earlier times, on 19 July, when the star Sirius rises just before dawn, the Egyptians would celebrate the beginning of the flood as their New Year's Day. At Memphis, the flood started in early July, reached its peak in early September, and fell through October, November, and December, with April and May being the period when the river was at its lowest. These timings of rise and fall, however, are more obvious on a graph than on the ground, where generally the period August to September was regarded as the season of high flood. But while there was dependable regularity in the rise and fall of the river, there was occasionally a year when the flood was delayed or ceased to come altogether. In olden times, with the flood coming when expected, the Egyptians would rejoice, and believing that it came through the magnanimity of the god of the Nile, would offer him thanks. And when it was delayed, they regarded the delay as a result of the wrath of this god. He was clearly a god to be propitiated. The Muslims knew all about the Nile, but a lot of what they knew was based on legend rather than geographical knowledge. They believed that Adam himself had blessed this river, and that it was one of the 4 rivers of paradise, the others being the Euphrates, the Tigris, and the Oxus. The Nile would flow with honey in paradise. They regarded it as the Lord of rivers, one to which God had subordinated all rivers on the earth, and believed that God spoke to the river twice every year. When the time came for its waters to rise, he would say, "Lo, Allah commands you to flow," and the river would rise. And when it had done its appointed task, God would command, "O Nile, go down," and the great river would go down like a well-trained pet. But the Muslims did not know about the human sacrifice which the Egyptians offered every year to propitiate the god of the Nile. It was the month of June, corresponding to the Copt month of Bauna, in which began the rise of the river. Muslims and Christians and pagans waited anxiously for the life-giving phenomena. Then a delegation of Coptic elders came to Amrbinalaas. "O commander, our land has this custom," they said, "and without it the Nile will not rise." "And what is that?" asked Amr. "When 12 days of this month have passed, we choose a young virgin, take her with her parents' consent, bedeck her with the best of clothes and ornaments, and throw her into the Nile." To the Egyptians this was a normal yearly practice, and they thought no more of it than of sacrificing a ram. The girl was thrown into the river as an offering to the god of the Nile in return for his bounty, and when a few days later the water began to rise, the people would assume that their god had accepted the gift and was showing his pleasure. But to the Muslims the idea was a horrible one, worse than cold-blooded murder, because it was done to please a god who did not exist and whose false image Islam had come to destroy. "This cannot be done in Islam," amrbinalaas replied firmly. "Islam has cancelled all that was before it." The Egyptians were distressed at the decision of the Muslim commander. They worried about their river and its rise and spread. If the flood did not come, there would be no crops in the land, and this in turn would lead to famine. And if the Nile withheld its flood for several years, Egypt would turn into a desert. The cities would have to be abandoned. The people would have to migrate. But no one dared to question or flout the decision of the Muslim commander, and the elders walked away in silence. The month of Bauna passed. The people looked anxiously at the level of the Nile. The rise should have begun, but the month ended with no sign of change. Another month passed, the Coptic month of Abib, and the fears of the Egyptians turned to despair. Their troubled eyes could discern no rise in the level of the water. The month of Misra began, that is August, and the sun continued to rise and set, but the Nile flowed low and sullen. The god of the Nile was showing his displeasure, and the Egyptians saw in it the end of their country. Egypt would be destroyed because they had failed to offer the annual sacrifice, and all this was due to the coming of the Muslims with their new faith. The people began to pack their bags and prepare to migrate to other lands. Even Amr got worried. All that they said about the sacrifice of a virgin and the god of the Nile was nonsense, of course, but he knew that nature could be fickle. If the flood were much delayed or did not come this year, it would not only have a destructive material effect upon the country, but people would think that Islam was the cause of their suffering, and he would be blamed personally for preventing the sacrifice, and thus being the chief instrument of their ruin. Amr wrote in haste to the Caliph and told him all about the situation and the unpleasant prospects. The vagaries of the Nile may have got the Muslim commander worried. They could have no effect on the Caliph at Medina. Upon reading Amr's letter, he at once wrote on a card, "In the name of Allah, the Beneficent, the Merciful, from the slave of Allah, Umar, commander of the faithful, to the Nile of Egypt. If you run by your own will, then cease to run. But if it is Allah, the One and Mighty, who makes you run, then we pray to Allah, the One and Mighty, to cause you to flow." He addressed a separate letter to Amrbinalaas. "You are right that Islam has cancelled all that was before it. I am sending you a card. When you get this letter, throw the card in the middle of the Nile." The people of Memphis and Babylon and Heliopolis, and other nearby towns and villages, were all packed to go. Their spirits were as low and lifeless as the water of the Nile which had failed them. Their despair was total. The time of a Christian feast was approaching, a feast known to the Muslims as the Day of the Cross, and the Copts should have been singing and dancing, celebrating the feast and rejoicing over the fertility of their soil and the ample salt-laden water which was making it even more fertile. But there was no joy in the hearts of the Egyptians as they prepared to march into a dark and unknown future. On the eve of the Christian feast, Amr flung the message of the Caliph into the Nile. During the night that followed, on one single night, the river rose to its full flood height, 16 cubits or 30 feet. Allah had commanded the river to flow and ended once and for all the evil custom of sacrificing a human being to the god of the Nile. Then there was the crisis created in Medina by the famine. While the Muslims in Egypt ate heartily and did not seem to have a care in the world, those in Medina were starving. The year of the famine is disputed. There was a famine in late 17 or early 18 Hijri, which Tabari names as the main famine. According to him, during this famine, Umar appealed to the governors of the provinces for help in dealing with the famine, and the first to come to the aid of Medina was Abu Ubaidah in Syria, while amrbinalaas too did his bit from Egypt. But Abu Ubaidah died in early 18 Hijri during the plague of Amawas, and the invasion of Egypt by amrbinalaas was not begun till the end of that year. Most probably there were two famines, the first in 18 Hijri and the second a few years later, both equal in severity. Balazuri gives 21 Hijri, that is 642 AD, as the year of the famine in which the Muslims in Egypt came to the rescue of their brothers in Medina. But there is much variation in the dates of events given by early Muslim chroniclers, and this may have occurred in the following year. The famine affected Medina and the surrounding countryside. Man and beast suffered grievously. Wild animals came into the town to seek food and shelter with men. Grazing animals had no flesh on them, and when a man slaughtered a goat for food, the sight of its fleshless bones repelled him. The famine was accompanied by a severe drought, and special prayers for rain were offered by the Muslims. The dust blown by the wind was as fine as ash, because of which this period became known as Amur Ramada, the year of the ashes. The Caliph was in despair. He felt helpless, utterly dependent on whatever the governors of the provinces could do to help, and since few provinces were more abundantly blessed by nature than Egypt, the Caliph wrote to Amr. From the slave of Allah, Umar, commander of the faithful, to amrbinalaas. Salutations. By my faith, O Amr, do you care when you and those with you eat your fill, that I and those with me are dying? O help! And again, O help! It was not long before Umar sent his answer. To the slave of Allah, Umar, commander of the faithful, from amrbinalaas. O ready, and again, O ready! I have sent you a caravan of which the first camel will be with you while the last is still with me. Peace be upon you and the mercy of Allah. Umar did send a huge caravan of which it is said the first camel was in Medina, while the last had yet not left for start. This must be a poetic exaggeration, of course, considering the distance of 1,000 miles between the two cities, but there is no doubt that vast numbers of camels were used by Umar to transport corn and other foods to the Muslim capital. The arrival of the head of the caravan gladdened the hearts of the sorely tried people of Medina. Umar appointed a few top companions to see to the distribution of food, and what was done was to give one camel to every household. The family first ate the food which the camel carried, then slaughtered the camel and ate its flesh, and then made such use as they could of the hide of the animal and the sacks in which the food had been packed. A little later, Amr switched the line of supply to Medina. He had the grain carried to the port of Kulzum, that is Suez, by the caravan and then loaded into boats for shipment to Arabia across the Red Sea, each boat carrying about 16,000 bushels. No doubt he did this to stop the faithful in Medina from eating up all his camels. The crisis was over, thanks to Egypt and to amrbinalaas, who had conquered that rich land. Their hunger satisfied, the Muslims of Medina felt a lot better. But in order to make the supply of grain from the granary of Egypt permanent and not contingent upon special efforts made to meet the needs of Arabian famine, the Caliph sought a more effective system of supply and transport than camelback. Perhaps he too feared that too many Egyptian camels were being eaten up by the faithful. He sent for amrbinalaas to discuss ways and means of solving the food problem. Amr reminded the Caliph that in days gone by, ships used to come to Arabia from Memphis with Egyptian traders by means of waterways then existent. But these waterways had been closed by the Romans, and the Egyptians had got blocked with sand and silt and were finally abandoned by the traders. If the Caliph wished, he could dig up the old canal and send to Arabia boats laden with corn. Yes, do so, said Umar. Amr went back to his quarters and told his comrades who had come with him from Egypt about his talk with the Caliph. They were not pleased. We fear that this arrangement will bring harm to Egypt. It will take the food and abundance of your land to the Hijaz, and your land will be ruined. You should oppose this project and tell the commander of the faithful that it is not fair, and we do not see how it can be done. The next day Amr went to take leave of the Caliph. Umar reminded him of their conversation and told him not to forget about the digging of the canal. O commander of the faithful, Amr said, the canal is completely blocked and it will need heavy expenditure. By him in whose hands is my life, Umar replied, I suspect that when you left me and spoke of this to the people of your land, they did not like it. I insist that you dig the canal and make ships sail in it. Amr was able to think of one more objection. If the people of the Hijaz get their food easily from Egypt, they will not go upon the holy war. Umar saw the point but was determined to have his canal. I will agree to one limitation, he said. Only for the people of Mecca and Medina will food be brought by sea. Let not more than 1 year pass before you have completed the task. There had been a canal linking the Nile with the Red Sea in pharaonic times. Herodotus mentions that seamen would sail their ships through the length of the Mediterranean, go through the straits, later named Gibraltar, down the west coast of Africa and up its east coast, and from the Red Sea they would sail along a canal to Memphis, and then down the Nile to the Mediterranean. The canal came into the Nile a little below Memphis through Heliopolis. This canal is known to have been cleared by the Roman Emperor Trajan early in the 2nd century AD, but had again fallen into disrepair and was not in use for some time before the Muslim conquest. When word spread in Fustat that a canal was to be dug to connect the Nile and the Red Sea, a Copt came to Umar and offered it to show him the alignment of the old one, if the Muslims would exempt him and his family from the payment of the jizya. Umar agreed to this condition, and the man showed the Muslims the alignment of the old canal. Work was at once started to clear the canal for a distance of 80 miles from the Nile to the Red Sea at Kulzum, that is Suez. It was completed within a year, and became known as the Canal of the Commander of the Faithful. It was used for transporting grain from Fustat to the Arabian coast, and remained in operation for several decades, before being abandoned in the time of the Umayyads. But while the canal was being dug, the Muslims were not sitting idle. Amrbinalaas had marched on with the bulk of his army for fresh conquests. End of chapter 10.